Good evening, everyone. And today we're back to book reviews, which I've got to make up a lot of lost ground on. And just because I know some people get really frustrated with review style videos dragging their feet, today we're going to be talking about The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And right off the bat, I will say it's a recommend. Just to be completely clear, I don't think I've actually covered anything that I wouldn't recommend under any circumstance. The closest was Scary Stories to Read in the Dark. I always get it mixed up with the title for the other thing. But at the end of the day, I still would recommend reading it. Just get the cheapest version of it that you can find. But we're going to be talking about something fun. Back to fantasy, which is something I have been missing because I've been reading a lot of things outside of my normal wheelhouse in order to try to have something different for the channel and like experience a few different things. But fantasy is what I enjoy the most. That's actually what I wrote, was a fantasy book. This is probably one of the most famous series in all of fantasy. But how did I end out not reading it for the better part of the 20 years that I've really been seriously reading fantasy books? Alright, so more or less, the best point of comparison I could give for this would be a somewhat less gratuitous version of A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, it's not got quite the same level of intrigue and whatnot, but I do think the general feel and setting is an appropriate comparison because there is magic in it, but it's mostly kind of subtle. A lot of it's more about the intrigue between characters, and so this is a more medieval style setting fantasy book. Now granted, this book of the series is more or less this series equivalent of the Fellowship of the Ring, if I'm going to draw a comparison to Tolkien. It's kind of like getting the whole D&D party together. Now, before I really get into actually talking about the book, I want to give a little bit of background on it. More or less what happened, I was sitting around one day and I saw a Kickstarter pop up from Joe Abercrombie. He'd always been on my list of authors to check out, just never have been in the right mood to actually read his stuff. Well, I saw that Kickstarter pop up, and the timing of it was more or less whenever I'm actually starting to contemplate really getting a serious book collection together, which this is a fraction of what I've got, but most of these are not exceptionally valuable except for maybe some of the Stephen King books that I bought when I was a kid, because I have a couple first editions that aren't in very good shape because I actually read them. But I've been thinking about actually trying to invest in some collectible books. Now, I know the Kickstarter for his, there's some issues in terms of things people aren't happy with about it. However, I will say to that, don't back a Kickstarter based off of what you hope it will have. Back a Kickstarter based off of what it says it will have and that it might try for. Don't worry about the might stuff. Look at what they guarantee. If you don't like what they guarantee, then wait and see if they expand on anything and then just do a late pledge. That's always an option that people seem to forget about. Anyway, so I've pledged and bought a complete signed copy of the hardcover version of this first trilogy. Well, I haven't read it, so that seems like a weird thing to invest in were it not for one thing. Joe Abercrombie has a solid reputation amongst fantasy readers. He's actually way up the list in terms of someone that people typically recommend to beginners. He is a very prominent fantasy author, in other words. There are a few people right now that are sort of your big, booming names, like Brandon Sanderson is super famous right now. Matt Dinniman, really big right now. Joe Abercrombie is every bit as up there as they are. And I do believe he's going to end up becoming a very long-lasting modern fantasy author, because I don't think a lot of his stuff is going to be sort of a flavor of the month type of thing. Not saying that Sanderson or Dinniman stuff is, because they're just super prolific writers. They have a whole bunch of stuff. The whole reason why I haven't actually reviewed any of Sanderson's things is because he doesn't really need my review. It's not like Abercrombie needs it either, but there's a million videos to watch on Sanderson. So my stuff would just be a drop in the bucket and probably wouldn't ding on anyone's radar. At the moment, there's probably not a lot of people talking about Abercrombie other than people talking about the Kickstarter. So makes sense to talk about him because it's a little bit different. So someone searching it may see a newer video pop up and boom, Sanderson, I would be surprised if there's not YouTube channels that post daily videos on him. But anyway, that's what actually got me to the point of reading it. I decided I needed to read all 3 of them at least before the books actually get here. And I have kind of a fun plan. I've finished reading this one. I have the second book, which is Before They Are Hanged, already loaded up on my Kindle. This looks nice because I decided to read them on Kindle. That way I could save the book. And then I'll do the video for that. And Last Argument of Kings, I will have it finished by the time I get my Kickstarter books in. And we'll sort of do a double dip video. I'll do an unboxing video for the Kickstarter and do the review of the last book of that trilogy there. Now, so is it a good book? Absolutely. I've seen online a lot of people comment that they think this is his worst book. I've even seen some people suggest that he has said he thinks it's his worst book. If this is his worst book, then there's nowhere to go but up, and I already enjoyed this. Like, if I were doing an arbitrary out of 10 scale, I would already say this is a 9 out of 10, which means it's not perfect, but I try to reserve 10 of 10 things for stuff that really, like, I feel like it's compulsory read. Like, Imagica is probably a 10 out of 10 for me, but that's at least in part probably due to nostalgia. So it's a book that I have consistently reread. The Blade itself is excellent. I can actually see myself in a decade maybe going back and rereading it just for fun. And I say a decade because he's got a lot of other books to read through first. And I generally don't start recycling books until I've read all the things that someone else has or someone has to offer. So, great book. The pacing is excellent. It doesn't really have any of the awkward moments that I really tend to hate in books. The way this is written stylistically is it's alternating perspectives. And that's relatively common within fantasy. That's what I did with my books, except he doesn't stick to one perspective per chapter necessarily. Sometimes he'll alternate within a chapter. But he does have a main cast of characters, and it rotates as to which one you're currently seeing the sort of perspective section from. You have your typical warrior character that is actually who the book starts out with. You have a guy that's a fencer, so I guess you could say a swordsman, but he has a personality you would probably peg as a D&D bard. Then you have an inquisitor, which he very much has all the characteristics you would expect of something that's going to invoke Spanish Inquisition. Wizard, yes, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect out of a wizard, sort of, except this is more the mystical, kind of unknowable, doesn't really reveal a whole lot of detail style wizard. And there are a couple other characters, with one other one that I think is going to actually be a main character, and she, not really sure what archetype she'd be into yet. The only thing that really sort of from D&D speak would fit her is that she is chaotic. I don't even know whether she's good or neutral yet. I'd say chaotic good, but definitely the wild card character, which I really hope gets tamed down a little bit, because so far all she's managed to do is piss me off because of the things that she's done. I understand, if I'm reading the story correctly, where her rage issues come from, but she has caused almost nothing but issues for other characters that seem more well balanced than she is. Granted, there is a heavy implication of severe mental illness with her. I would say they'll tone her down, like the other characters, I mean, not Abercrombie. I would say her interactions with the other characters will slowly turn her down in the next book, and she'll probably become a lot more likable at that point, because she is interesting. It's just I don't tend to really like those characters that just throw things into chaos. Kind of, that's it. She's a murder hobo, more or less. Just killing everything out of rage rather than just because she can. Anyway, that's enough of the particular details there. What I would recommend with something like this is, instead of diving into the details about the story, because this is something where you're better off knowing as little about the story as you can, because what's going to happen is this is a super character-driven book. From what I understand, his next couple books are a little bit more action-oriented, because he does have good action scenes, and he writes fight scenes very, very well. There's just not many of them in this first book. But from what I understand, the action sort of picks up. This first book is very character heavy. Now, when I was younger, I wouldn't have been able to stand it. I have actually recently come to the conclusion that I need to reread Lord of the Rings, because the last time I tried to read it, I found it almost unbearably boring at certain points. It had a good story at its core, but it just droned on and on and on. Thing is, now that I'm older, a lot of the droning on and on and on, I actually kind of enjoy, because I do it myself in real life. That is both an effect of being older and also having been a teacher for over a decade now. I tend to overtalk. Now, aside from it being a heavily character-driven book, it is actually a good sort of political intrigue type of story as well. There's basically two big stories that are running in parallel, with some subplots that weave into those other stories that some of the characters involved in the subplots really don't seem to be aware of the other stories. But you have a massive war brewing between multiple major nations from the very first start of the book. You also have potential conspiracies going on. Now, I say potential because they might be conspiracies, or it might be conspiracies about conspiracies in order to consolidate power. That'd be a good way to put it. Outside of that, there seems to be an even bigger plot developing that involves these things called flatheads, which is basically this book's term for orcs, and some other ancient entity, I guess, at some sort. I'm not sure. You don't really get a good, clear idea of what's going on with the wizard character, except for the fact that he's very old, and there is something going on beyond the war, and to the point where he doesn't really care about the war. And I don't want to dive too much into that plot, because almost everything about that gets revealed is a big, oh, moment. And that's the type of spoilers I don't like getting. I don't mind hearing spoilers about some key details, like how a specific fight plays out or anything along those lines. However, hearing the real surprise moments can be a little bit irritating, and most of those involve your wizard character. So if you want something that's more of a classic kind of high fantasy-ish, no. If you want something that's more of a classical fantasy, go with this. Now, I see people describe it as grimdark a lot, and unless things get a hell of a lot more grim, this isn't really grimdark to me, but I could be coming at it from a slightly jaded perspective, because the first thing I think of when I think of grimdark is Diablo 3 or Warhammer 40k. And this doesn't have nearly the level of oppressiveness going on that either of those series have. It actually has some hope for the characters to actually have good lives or enjoy themselves or has happy moments. Not to say that those things don't exist, like Warhammer has a decent amount of humor to it, but Diablo, especially Diablo 4, almost everything is hyper oppressive. So it could just be that the things I think of when I think of grimdark are so extreme grimdark that other things that technically qualify just don't quite hit the same itch for me. But I do see that consistently thrown out there about it, so you may want to take that into account. I don't think it's grim or all that dark. It has some dark moments, but all good fiction does. I think it's just good fiction in general, and good fantasy. I definitely see that Joe Abercrombie has earned his place as popular as he is. And for a first book, this is phenomenal. Super good first book. There's no real weaknesses to it to me. I'm also not all that hypercritical, but to reiterate, this is the first book of the First Law Trilogy. He has 3 other books in this same universe that are standalones, and I believe he has one sequel trilogy set in the same universe. I'm not 100% certain on that one, but then he has a bunch of other series as well. One that takes place in sort of a Viking era. His newest book apparently takes place in like an actual version of Europe, and he's just written a ton of literature, and most of it receives really good praise. So if you're curious about his works, what I tend to find is a good idea to do is start with their first book, just simply because they do nothing but improve. If you don't do that with Terry Pratchett's books, it's kind of hard to make it through some of the early Discworld books compared to the later ones, because the quality has went up so much by the end. But Joe Abercrombie, The Blade itself, I highly recommend. Now, let's take a moment and explain what my plan is for book reviews moving forward on the channel. Because my goal coming into this in January was to actually do at least one a month. Do 1 week where is dedicated to book content to emphasize the book part of this channel. So, The Blade itself was meant to be January's book, so it's been done for a little bit. The next book that I'll be coming out with a review for will be Dungeon Crawler Carl. Because what I've decided to do is, since I had read that this was Grimdark, I was going to alternate it with something a little bit more positive in order to actually have a break. So, this book first. I've already read the first book for Dungeon Crawler Carl, so I'm ready to actually review it. And I have read a couple other books on the side that they may or may not get their own review videos. Like, I read My Best Friend's Exorcism, and I'm probably going to do a video on that because it was kind of a fun book. And right now I'm reading Recipes for an Unexpected Afterlife. Guy I came across on TikTok, and so far it's kind of interesting. Once I finish that, I'm going to go into the second book of the First Law series, and then followed by the second book of Dungeon Crawler Carl, and then I'll finish out First Law. So that should take me up to the point where I actually get my Kickstarter pledge in, if they stick to their timeline. Now, that is just what I have coming up. So these first couple reviews, so Dungeon Crawler Carl, the one that you're watching right now, and probably My Best Friend's Exorcism will all come out decently rapid fire to cover January, February, and March. Then Unexpected Afterlife should be April. Next First Law book will be May. Then Matt Dinniman's Dungeon Crawler Carl series back again in June. And then July is when I think the Kickstarter is supposed to land or be delivered, and I should actually be ready for the final book of that First Law Trilogy by then to also do the combination unboxing. Now, we'll see how well that plays out. If I manage to squeeze anything else in, I may actually do a few extra book reviews. That's just the minimum that I plan on actually working into the channel. I want to start getting those to be a regular part of the channel again. And then, of course, around Halloween time, do some readings again, because I find it fun to do that. But we'll see how it goes. Plans haven't been held together super well lately, but anyway, that's it for the video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, drop it below. If you have any book recommendations of things you thought or think would be fun to do for the channel, also drop those below. You have a good night.